Okay, so tonight, folks, the presentation is on REDs and the effect that they can have in terms of not only your health but performance in going forward. And I think part of the importance in terms of nutrition is that you need to look at your short-term goals, which obviously are probably very different and may change really from time to time, but we also need to keep an eye on that longer term piece as well. And for us really, where does nutrition play a big role? Well, obviously the main aim is to allow you guys to train and compete as well as possible, but also to provide enough nutrients for daily life. And it's really important that we take that into consideration as well. It does mean different things to different people, depending on your requirements, depending on your training status, depending on lots of different things. So it's really, really important that one size doesn't fit all, and it's really important that you have to look at your training schedule as opposed to just parachuting something in because you've seen somebody else doing it, etc. Next slide, Danielle. So obviously from your point of view, not only as the athlete, but obviously coaches as well, you want to be able to achieve your competition performance, and you also want to be able to achieve your training adaptation. And you have to remember, if there's not enough fuel in the tank to fuel the training that you're trying to do, then it's highly unlikely that we are going to get really good training adaptations. For example, if you're lifting and you're wanting to gain lean muscle mass, which is going to improve endurance, strength, speed, well, if you're not eating, you can only do that if you're in positive energy balance, i.e. there's more going in than is coming out. And we'll talk about cases where, for example, you may do a session and you may be exceptionally sore the next day. Well, that is a good indicator that muscle mass has been broken down to try and fuel the activity that you've just done. So it's really, really important that we do put in enough to ensure that each of your sessions is cost neutral as well. But why is it so difficult really to navigate this training and eating or fueling tightrope? You would think it would be simple enough, but it's not, because I suppose one of the questions that I would ask an athlete on a regular basis is, does your training routine change on different days? And quite often that answer is yes, of course it does. And the next question I'll ask is, does your dietary intake or what you eat, does it change on different days? And quite often we're creatures of habit. We like to do the same things on the same days or on different days. So food intake remains the same and training is different. So that straight away indicates that there's a problem. So if the training load goes up on a certain day, then automatically you have a mismatch there as well. And one of the other reasons is that there's a lot of absolute rubbish out there. So for example, if you think about it, it's a real maze of information that you're getting in terms of, things like eating at night, for example. That would be one that I'd hear a lot of. Oh, it's not good for your body composition. You're more likely to put on weight. If you train it in the evening and you're training first thing in the morning, it's really, really important that you actually do eat at night to try and refuel what you've just done and prep for the next session as well. Instagram and social media are lethal. There's some messages coming across there that are highly influential and really they're not fit for purpose. So again, athletes running 10K, 15K and putting up, big lettuce and tomatoes. There's no calories there. There's no carbohydrate there. So that is not really fueling what you've just done. So that is going to be tricky to manage in the longer term. Carbs, for some athletes, there are issues with them, and they're getting such a bad press. Natural is safe. Well, there's lots of things that are natural that aren't safe for you. For example, arsenic is natural, but I wouldn't necessarily consider it as safe. So you have to remember that there's lots of messages out there that are quite conflicting. But again, this is where that piece where one size fits all is, or doesn't fit all, is really, really important. And you have got to look at your eating patterns around your training as well. So the the background really to this, and this is where Danielle is going to come in, because she has done her PhD in this, and really it's looking at trying to balance the books here in terms of what is going in versus what is going out versus what is needed underneath as well. So I'll hand over to you, Danielle.
Here, Sharon. So as Sharon said, it's not easy trying to get the balance right. And a concept that's lending a hand to awareness around fueling is energy availability. So what that is, it's the energy needed to fuel your bodily functions after you take out the energy that you use during a training session. So if, for example, an athlete finds themselves in a state of low energy availability, this means that there isn't enough energy left over in the body for the body to function normally. So for example, if it was a female athlete, there may be a stoppage of periods. And then for males, there may be hormonal disruption or a lower bone mineral density, as you would see from the thing like a DEXA scan. So how might energy availability be reduced then? Well, it can be reduced for a number of different reasons. It can be due to the increased energy expenditure above your energy intake, so changes in your training volume. If you're training twice or training back to back, morning and evening. The inadvertent impacts on energy intake, so the lack of knowledge around nutrition, the timing of your training sessions conflicting with eating opportunities, and sometimes after training sessions, athletes just don't feel like eating, and lower energy density. And I think that feeds into the social media piece that Sharon was talking about. You know, it's all these lovely colourful plates, but there's no energy in those types of foods, full of nutrients, full of micronutrients, but not giving you the substantial calories you need to replace that you used during that session. And then you have your dysfunctional eating behaviours. So athletes can go from a healthy eating state right through to an eating disorder. And there's also disordered eating behaviours like restricting eating to control your weight or to regulate emotions, and then a negative body image can be associated with that as well. So low energy availability then, and how I suppose this works on the bodily systems. So the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, this is what controls the sex hormones, so the production of testosterone for males and estrogen for females. So in males and females, there is evidence to suggest that low energy availability inhibits this gonadal axis, leading to disruptive reproductive hormones and then a lower bone mineral density, as the lack of testosterone, estrogen isn't there for bone reabsorption and rebuilding. So there's been a lot of work gone into this area over the last 30 years, particularly within the female cohort. But then in 2014, the IOC introduced this new term called REDS. And I suppose it's to capture that male athletes are also impacted by low energy availability, and that the role differs between male and female athletes. So there is not enough evidence there, but potentially males are more robust to low energy availability compared to females. But what the publication of REDS has identified, that there is a lack of research in male athletes, particularly in large samples. There's no standardized methods for measuring low energy availability, and that we need further research. So we can see the triangle in the top circle, if you like, and then we have the performance ones at the bottom, just below the soccer player there. So we can see that there needs to be further evidence to link in these negative health and performance outcomes associated with REDS in males as well. So low energy availability, like I said, there's far more research done on females, but we can see that in male cohorts like cyclists, endurance trained athletes, and then our active Irish male cohort, that there is a risk there between 70% in the cyclists, 58 to 67% in the endurance athletes, and then within our active Irish males, which I'll go into in further detail in a wee minute. So that was from recreationally active right through the elite level, we have 23% at risk. So it's not just a female dominant problem. And another thing that males need to be aware of as well, and that's where Sharon's talking about, you know, those training sessions where you're not fueling correctly and thinking about the timing after them, is with in-day energy deficiency. So this is where I suppose the performance nutritionist would look at energy intake and exercise energy expenditure and assess it at 1 hour intervals. And this provides greater insight into real life changes, so in and around training sessions. So what this study looked at was the relationship between within the energy deficiency and RMR. So despite having a similar energy availability across the day, those athletes that were spent more time, so 21 hours versus 11 hours, within an energy deficit exceeding 400 calories, had suppressed RMR, and they also had higher blood cortisol levels and lower testosterone levels. So we can see that it is having a physiological impact the longer you spend in a calorie deficit, even though your energy might be substantial across the day. So it's really important to make sure that you're fueling in and around sessions as well. So as you can imagine, identifying low energy isn't a simple diagnosis. You need insight into an athlete's energy intake, their exercise energy expenditure, and you need a body composition assessment as well. So if, for example, you're looking at an athlete's exercise energy expenditure, you need to think about things like what's their job, are they cycling to work, are they walking to work, how many training sessions they're doing per day. With their energy intake, it's also quite hard to capture because you're relying on all self-reported data, and then body composition as well. It comes with its own limitations. So one thing that we're using in the Institute is an RMR assessment. So what an RMR assessment is, it represents the energy cost of your basic bodily functions. So include things like your reproductive function and thermoregulation. So there is a ratio that has been identified within the female population, and it's used as a marker to identify energy deficiency, but they're still working on one within the males. But before that, we need to screen both males and females to determine if there is energy deficiency there. And that's, I suppose, the most cost-effective way of determining and identifying the problem before it becomes a bigger issue. So within the endurance training cohort, endurance training has been linked with alterations in the reproductive hormonal profile. And it has been said that males displaying such changes are thought to exhibit this exercise hypogonadal male condition. And what that really is, it's the same as the complete stoppage of menses for the female athletes. So it fits into that REDS theme very well. And how might we go about assessing that? Well, the 2 questionnaires that you have completed, they're about a week and a half ago. The first one was the LEAN questionnaire, and it consists of 40 questions that are related to low energy availability. So things like dizziness, regulation of body temperature, your GI function, your health problems interfering with training and competition, and your well-being and recovery. And then, as that questionnaire isn't a validated measure, we also included the ADMQ. Although this questionnaire wasn't validated within an active population, it still gives us a better insight, and we have adapted some of the questions for an active cohort as well. So what we did with the Irish cohort that we looked at in 2018, ranging from recreationally active to elite level, we sent out these 2 questionnaires online and centred around the different sport governing bodies under Sport Ireland. And what we found was, well, first of all, 945 completed the questionnaire, and then we had to exclude ones as they had, 118 were over the age of 44, 20 reported chronic illness, and 13 did not meet the physical activity guidelines, leaving us with a sample of 794. So off that sample then, we had 90 international representatives, 133 provincial and inter-county, and 364 competitive at club level, and 205 recreationally active individuals. So some of the key findings then from that was that 23% of the active males who completed that questionnaire were at risk for exercise hypogonadal male condition. That's versus the 38% of this cohort that we screened there a few weeks ago of the elite Irish athletic males, 38% of those. Those at risk were 8 times more likely to have lower than normal sex drive rating and 5 times more likely to have less than 3 morning erections per week. They were also at risk 7 times more likely to lack energy for training and lack strength and fail to make progress in their strength training. And they were twice as likely to lack sleep several nights a week and to feel unhappy and not on top of their life outside of sport. So again, it's thinking of the bigger picture and looking at nutrition as a potential marker here when it comes to these other parameters. So priority screening should be given to the elite level population as your training load is a lot higher than the general public, and elements of fitness, sleep, sex drive and energy may be useful when identifying active males at risk. So having a lower than normal sex drive rating, less than 3 morning erections, lacking energy for training, lacking strength and not making progress in your strength training, and lack of sleep several nights a week, and then feeling unhappy and not on top of life outside of sport. Sharon, are you okay to step in here for the case study?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose we looked at a couple of, we mentioned a couple of things, and what I want us to look at now is particularly how you set your week up, and looking at particularly that within day training, because I think that's really important in terms of looking not only as each day, but also where your training sessions occur relative to the last one. And I think it's really, really important to remember that that can have a significant impact in your ability to get the amount of calories that you need in and carbohydrate for that particular period of time. So if we take, for example, this athlete. Now, this athlete was actually a triathlete, so I know not just purely athletics, but it did do quite significant runs within sessions. And obviously there are other factors in here, but what I wanted to give you an example was there's a couple of things going on here, because he had read some information around things like fasted training sessions where you can fat adapt, and therefore this is obviously a performance enhancer. So this particular athlete basically could do, let's say, an average of 3 training sessions in a 15-hour period. And I'm talking, the one that comes to mind is really a Monday evening where he would have done a long run, let's say at 5 o'clock. He would have got up at 6 to do a fasted swim from 6 till about 8. And then he would have had breakfast, and he would have been in the gym to do some weights then in and around 12 to 1. He could have actually done 5 sessions in a 30-hour period as well. So you need to look at how that sits. But one of the things that he would report was after his Monday, Tuesday, for him Wednesday was a particularly poor day in terms of his ability to train, fatigue levels, how good those training sessions were. So then suddenly he started to get habitually low ferritin levels, which obviously we know is our storage form of iron, but could obviously affect performance and can increase your risk of getting colds and flus because of its link to immunity. And then he started to pick up lots of niggly injuries. Nothing major, but enough to keep him out of training for maybe blocks of 7 days, etc., etc. So his training was inconsistent. He was training inconsistently because of picking up niggles, but also picking up colds. So this was obviously a concern for him, because it was having a knock-on effect on his performance. So what the next couple of slides, you may not be able to see it massively, but I just wanted to give you an idea of his intakes pre and post intake. So Danielle, can you switch over? So realistically here, this was his pre-discussion with me, and his intakes were kind of around about 2,200 calories. His carbohydrate was around about 235, 240 grams. Protein was okay, and fat was relatively low. But you can see that his requirements were probably close to 4,000 calories, and actually his calorie requirements was probably for periods of time, particularly that Monday evening into Tuesday, was probably closer to 5,000. Now you can see that his breakfast on those days were actually very small, and that was the breakfast between his swim session and his gym session. So if we move on to the next slide, this is really what we tried to increase it to. So basically we increased his breakfast from about 400 calories a day to closer to 1,900. Now people might say that's completely crazy. He wasn't too enamored with it himself, but the fasted sessions were not working for him, because fundamentally the big problem that he was he was actually putting his fasted sessions in completely the wrong place. There is good scientific evidence behind fasted sessions, but not in the biggest element of the biggest load in the week. So he needed to look at where he was going to put that, and actually that was doing him more harm than good again, coming back to, just because it's out there and just because there might be some evidence for it, it doesn't mean that that can be applied to you as well. So he was sponsored by one of the companies, so we put in a meal replacement and not whey protein before he got into the pool to do his session, and then his second breakfast then would have been porridge, berries, honey, etc., etc. So if we move on to the next slide, his total intake for the day went up to about 5,000 calories, which you can see drives his carbohydrate intake up, which is really, really important. But it also drives all the other nutrients up as well. And this is the really important bit about eating to meet your requirements. Not only do you meet your requirements for energy or calories, but you also actually meet your requirements for the other really important nutrients as well. So this required a huge amount of effort, a big amount of work. Consistently, he would have fallen off the wagon in terms of being able to do this. But what he did notice is that he started to achieve better, consistent training. And his big concern about this was, obviously, he was going to gain weight. He said, have you ever tried to go up a hill on a bike? Do you understand? So in my opinion, I felt his weight would bump up, yes, initially, because he is eating more, but then it would flatten down again. And that's exactly what happened. He did actually gain a kilo. He gained more than a kilo at the start, but that dropped back down. But when we looked at his body composition, he'd actually gained an extra kilo of muscle mass, which allowed him to be a bit stronger as well. So the next slide, Danielle. So really for us, food isn't the enemy. It can actually fuel you better, and more consistent performances can be achieved. Weight isn't the enemy either. I really do believe that we need to look at this racing weight in terms of context. So yes, it is important at times, but you cannot maintain a racing weight throughout the season. You have to look at where you actually need to taper and try to achieve that weight, but look to maybe come back up again as well. When you do increase and match your energy requirements, there will be a bump in weight initially, but it should actually come down as well. Listen to your body cues. For females, it is easier, but for males, you can and do have, athletes can have issues. And Danielle has given you some idea of what some of those may be. Do listen to them. And what I would say is that injury and sickness, if they're happening on a very regular basis, or you go into that for a period of time, you're really just not that unlucky. So you do need to reflect and review the whole picture. And I think that period of time as well, of days of the week, is really, really crucial as well. And just to finish off, I think is the last slide maybe. This takes a wee bit of time. You're not going to get there in one go, because you have to change your habits. New habits are sometimes much more difficult. What I would suggest is have a look at your week, see where the real pressure points are and the big load items in terms of, let's say, a 20-hour period or a 30-hour period or a 36-hour period, and then really try and focus in on that and work out from there. And you will notice that the sessions after that are subsequently much better as well. And I think, and really just, I suppose, the final slide is that, again, coming back to that, being influenced by what else is going on. It's really, really important to feel, how good are you feeling. The mirror or what you see doesn't tell you everything that's going on. It's very, very important that we shouldn't be influenced by, having a six-pack or, as a number on scales, because it may not tell you the full picture. It may not tell you what's going on below the level of the surface of the skin, but the body will have a great way of stopping you in its tracks. And realistically, this is the one thing that we want to stop, is that risk of injury and that risk of sickness, which does impact on your training, which will impact on your performance. So thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Danielle. That was very good. I have a question or two here, but do any of the athletes have any questions at this stage?
No, thank you. That was good.
Okay. I guess one question I have here is lots of athletes have stepped up their training particularly during lockdown, I know there's numerous guys have gone up by 10, 15 miles in their training volume. Do you have any tip? Obviously, if they were meeting their injury requirements before and they've had that increase in training volume, to continue to meet them, they're going to need to make some changes nutritionally. Do you have any tips to get that extra energy on board? Or
Danielle, do you want to start off?
Yeah, well, it's, I suppose, adding in another meal, or adding in something like a smoothie, something that's, I suppose, palatable and that sits well with that athlete, and trying to work it in and around the training sessions, as opposed to, you know, just having your set meal, breakfast, lunch and dinner, making sure that it fits around the sessions to avoid getting into that within day energy deficiency.
Yeah, because you're trying to fill the gaps, and I think that's where, you know, those shakes and smoothies are much more palatable, as Danielle had said, because one of the big impacts of increased intensity and increased load is actually reduction in appetite. So don't use appetite as your driver for wanting to eat as well, because I've seen that where athletes just either actually quite feel sick or have no interest in it. So it's really important to try and bring liquids. Can be an easier option whenever that happens. The other thing is just, and this will come in one of the resources that we do send out at a later stage as well. Obviously, from an athletics point of view, one of the key injuries we want to avoid is bony injuries. And again, calcium containing foods in and around high, you know, big load sessions are potentially really important as well, because there has been some evidence to suggest that we lose calcium in sweat, and if we can offset those losses at the time of training, the body doesn't have to go into the bone to replace the calcium, if you see what I mean. So it's a good way of making sure that you're cost neutral, not only from your cost to calories, but also the important nutrients such as calcium as well. So again, for us, dairy is a big, it's an easy way of doing that. If you don't consume dairy, then do look to other alternatives, such as maybe, you know, soya that is fortified with calcium, but make sure that you're, you know, getting a like for like there.
Very good. And you've kind of touched on it there, but I think as guys run more, the challenge can be finding the time to eat, because there's that window before they run. They don't want to consume too much. In terms of high density foods, is there any energy dense foods? Are there any tips around that?
So again, if we go back to that case study there, it's really, really important to look at what you do the night before. So if you get up early for an early session, you may not want to eat a lot. So I think the liquids can play a big role there in terms of those smoothies and shakes. But what you have to almost see your supper or that nighttime feed before you go to bed as part of your breakfast strategy for that next session. So again, that's where it's really important not to, so again, there's a temptation with a lot of athletes that, oh, this is an easy day or a rest day, therefore I don't need to eat as much. That's a disaster. You have to use that day really proactively and see that as an active recovery day, rather than this is a rest day, therefore I don't need to eat as much, because actually it's trying to offset the cost of the day before and prep you for the next day, for the next session as well. So don't see isolated days or sessions. Try to look at the big picture. Danielle, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and it was just even from chatting, those interviews that I'm doing with some of the athletes that have been told to eat more, you know, they have the luxury of adding things like cream into their curry and butter in their potatoes because they need to get extra calories. So just doing simple things like that at each meal as well can make a difference, especially whenever you are trying to get as much in and it's difficult. Making small changes like that, whilst Sharon says adding in things like those breakfasts that was discussed in the case study, can make all the difference.
And again, you have to remember that you're not the same as the general public. This advice would not be the same advice that we would be given to somebody who's sitting on a sofa for 24 hours of the day or sitting behind a desk. Cream or, you know, those types of things, that just wouldn't happen. But you are very different. You know, if you look at the amount of kilometers you're doing every week, we have to look at energy dense options that is not going to fill you up, that is not going to make you feel as if you're bloated, is not going to have an effect on your guts. And again, this is where it's sometimes really important not to look at those really low calorie options but high fiber options, which fill you up but don't give you the calories that you need, but also run the risk then of your guts being overloaded and then maybe runner's trots or something coming off the back of that too. So it's really important to remember that the advice for you guys is very different to the general population. And let's be clear here, you know, people might say that's not healthy. Health is context. We see elevated cholesterol, significantly elevated cholesterols in athletes that are not meeting their energy requirements. When they increase their calorie intake, be that from things like cream or butter, which is not that we hear in the general population don't eat that, we can actually bring down people's cholesterol. But the cholesterol is elevated because they're not eating enough. And what happens is the liver releases cholesterol to try and fuel what you're doing, and then that cholesterol is circulating in the blood, hence the reason why it goes up. Blood lipids go up, but that's a risk factor for heart disease as well. So health is about context as well, Matt.
Yeah, very good. And I think we see athletes that have recurrent injuries that don't deal with these issues, or the performances are inconsistent and they don't. And clearly, often people realise too late that it's their energy availability that's been an issue. So I think it's great to have had this discussion. Hopefully, be moved to be more proactive. I think also it's important athletes, even if themselves don't struggle, they will come across other athletes that on their squads, and particularly those in college that they'll come across, and being able to recognise some of the signs in other athletes and maybe give them advice early is sort of
and I think if you look at, you know, if you are getting bloods done, and it's maybe something people could consider, is things like cholesterol, things like ferritin, things like thyroid function are abnormal. We hear of, you know, athletes that are going on thyroxine. This is to do with energy availability. You know, that's not to do with the fact that you're just unlucky and you have a bad thyroid. It's not. It's to do with the fact that the thyroid starts to slow the system down to try and manage the lack of energy coming in, and that's why people's thyroid function are abnormal. So we need to really look at that. These are the signals and warning symptoms that athletes, particularly males, can use. In terms of things like testosterone levels, quite often we don't see them going very, very low, but what we do see them is going into the final or lower quartile, or, you know, the lower third of results. So it may not be clinically deficient, but actually it's low compared to maybe, you know, what it should be. So again, these are kind of blood, you know, results that people maybe should be looking into on a relatively regular basis as well.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions arisen from the athletes? Or Sharon, anything to add there?
I suppose, Danielle, maybe you might give a bit of an idea of what's happening next in terms of scores, what resources we're going to give out, and the way forward, just in case people, and I know not everybody's on this, but hopefully they'll look at the recording, just what to expect next.
Yeah, so it's not really a score as such with the males. It's more if a male reported that they had a low or no sex drive, or they were presenting with symptoms associated with low energy availability, they'd be classified as at risk, versus those that had normal to high sex drive rating versus or plus no symptoms. So it'll just be a quick email to give you an idea of where you've fallen in that, and then we'll also send through infographics on REDS just to show you the signs and symptoms, a breakdown of where there's gaps in your training schedule across the week where you need to be thinking about. So if you're walking the dog on the Saturday, say, and you had a heavy session on the Friday evening and you have another heavy session on the Sunday, is that really necessary on the Saturday? And then there's a little bit on bone health as well. And then on Friday, I'll send out an email then, just a quick evaluation form, just with regards to the screening and the online webinars, and then the infographics to follow.
Super. Okay, thanks very much for joining us, and yeah, you'll get so you'll get that feedback from Danielle in the next couple of days. So,
I think we're down to one, are we?
Thanks a million.
I've just made you the host there again, Matt.
Okay, thanks very much.